Hello, welcome to this episode of Interventions. I'm Professor Anand Nandkumar, Executive Director of SRITNE Center for Information Technology and the Network Economy. I'm also an Associate Professor of Strategy and Entrepreneurship at the Indian School of Business. In this series of videos, I'll attempt to link theory with practice so that managers can apply these theories to make better decisions, while at the same time academics can come up with more nuanced theories that better reflect the phenomena that we see and hear around us. And today I would like to talk about the food delivery business. I might also refer to it as platform-based food delivery business every now and then. Both of these actually mean the same thing for the purposes of this video. The online food delivery market in India is now worth about 4.66 billion in 2020. And what's more, that we are likely to see exponential growth over the next few years, and this industry is expected to grow at about 28% CAGR between 2020 and 2026. But the industry did not start off this way, right? It had a very modest beginning in about 2016. In 2016, online food delivery platforms were not as ubiquitous as it is today. And today, several of us not only use this platform at least once a day, and some of us maybe in fact use this platform several times in a day as well. So how did this industry evolve into such a large one? At a first blush, all of us might be tempted to think that it was perhaps because of the outbreak of COVID-19, when a lot of us could not move outside our houses and we were dependent on some of these food delivery companies for our meal, right, or next day meal or whatever else, right? What might have contributed to this growth is just not COVID, right? There are maybe other reasons as well. But this also brings us back to this question of how do industries in general, how are they born, how do they evolve and mature, which is what I would like to focus on today. And one of the key defining features of industry evolution is just this idea of hockey stick growth. Sometimes we would call this as sales takeoff as well. And if you stare at the picture, you can see there are periods of gradual growth. At some point in time, there is this hockey stick type of growth before when the industry sales also matures. Remember, I'm talking about industry sales over here, and what we are plotting in this picture is industry sales over a period of time. The hockey stick growth basically signals the evolution of an industry. This is when the industry essentially emerges, right? So what are the ideas that generate these hockey stick kind of a growth pattern, and what essentially generates its maturity? Before I start, here are a few basics. I want to talk about how market prices are itself determined. And some of you would have read this from your economics textbooks, but I just wanted to jog your memory of how prices are determined in the market. Obviously, prices are determined with the intersection of demand and supply, which is what you see in the picture that is flashing in front of you. The price of a product or a service is determined by demand for the product and the supply of it. When more firms enter, the supply curve essentially gets pushed down, and at which point in time the price decreases whereas the quantity consumed increases, right? This is the first point that I want you to remember. The second point is that when there is essentially craze for a product or a service, it is the demand curve that essentially shifts out, and a shifting out of the demand curve essentially increases both prices as well as the quantity consumed. So have this at the back of your mind. The reason why I would like you to think about it is, now I want you to think about what would happen when there is essentially a sales takeoff. When there is a sales takeoff, it is likely that the demand curve essentially gets pushed outside, which means that the prices and the quantity consumed are both likely to increase. So let me now talk about the theories that guide our understanding of industry evolution itself. So I'm going to first talk about the innovation gamble model. And this model was essentially proposed by Jovanovich and McDonald's, two economists in America. So let us see what they actually tell us. There are a few assumptions that they make, and their model is essentially an offshoot of the famous Schumpeterian model of creative destruction. Some of you might have heard about this interesting term, creative destruction, which was proposed by the Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter. And Jovanovich and McDonald's model is essentially a more formalization of the idea of creative destruction. They do make a few assumptions, and to essentially come up with a few boundary conditions that guide their theory. The first one is that they assume that the demand curve is essentially fixed over time. This means that there is no variation over time in the demand curve, in the industry demand curve. A new industry is created by a basic innovation gamble, right? So there are multiple people trying to solve problems, and a new industry is born when there is a basic innovation, when one of the basic innovation gambles actually works out for a given entrepreneur. This basic innovation leads to a new product, and once this new product is introduced, there are several competitors that enter to develop it as well. The output that they produce depends, of course, on their technology, right? What do I mean by technology? Anything that can convert a set of inputs into a bunch of outputs. And this in turn determines their average cost that is required to convert inputs into outputs, right? So the technology determines how much that they produce, conditional on entry. Since the entry of a new firm increases competition and decreases prices, entry occurs until firms can no longer be profitable. So with the entry of every given firm, the prices essentially decreases, and entry stops when firms can no longer be profitable. So in this model, what creates the sales takeoff or the hockey stick like growth pattern? It is essentially the success of the product innovation gamble. When there is this basic innovation that comes into the picture, that is when there is a lot of entry, and that is what creates the hockey stick like industry sales growth pattern. What, on the other hand, creates shakeout or industry consolidation in this model? It is essentially the advent of a process innovation gamble. What do I mean by it? There are people who are at the same time trying to make their product or services more efficient as well. Once there is a successful product innovation gamble, it is only then the process of shakeout or industry consolidation starts to happen. Firms that have access to this gamble can actually produce their product or service at a much cheaper cost. And customers are naturally going to prefer cheaper products and services over maybe more costlier ones. This once again results in new firm entry because there is profit to be made now, right? So given that there are avenues for sort of making margins, there is also more entry. An exit happens because some firms cannot acquire this process innovation gamble or this process innovation itself. And to the extent that incumbents that essentially created the successful product innovation gamble are also poised to acquire these process innovations, they are probably more likely to persist. So there is somewhat of an implication about how maybe more incumbents are more likely to survive even after the advent of a successful process innovation gamble. The second theory is essentially this idea of dominant design, and this was essentially proposed by two strategists, once again US strategists, Suarez and James Utterback. What does this theory say, right? Once again, this theory also assumes that there is a fixed demand curve that does not vary over time. And what is a dominant design? A dominant design is just a set of enduring product standards to which the bulk of the industry conforms to. And what happens in this model? Predominant design, there is a lot of experimentation. There is a lot of product innovation. People or potential entrants are trying to figure out the best way to solve a problem. And after dominant design emerges, the emphasis somewhat moves to process improvements, right, that minimize costs. Again, just to reiterate, the demand does not vary over time. In this model, what creates the hockey stick like growth pattern? It is essentially this idea of experimentation and product innovation at the initial stages of the industry. Many people are essentially trying to innovate, and that is what essentially creates the hockey stick like growth pattern in the industry itself. In this model, what creates shakeout and industry consolidation? It is essentially the advent of dominant design, right? Remember, this is the de facto standard that the industry conforms to, and after dominant design, the emphasis shifts to process innovation. And to the extent that process innovation requires high levels of capital investments, right, entry also becomes much harder. and the cost gets pushed down, so much so that firms that cannot or are unable to do this kind of process innovation essentially end up quitting this industry. The third theory is by another economist called as Stephen Klepper, right? And he talks about a continuous innovation model, right? Just to give you a perspective on this continuous innovation model, the previous two theories somewhat assume a sequence to the patterns of innovation in an industry. First, if you think about the dominant design model, there is this idea of product innovation that happens first, and then process innovation eventually follows after the advent of dominant design. And if you think about the first model that we spoke about, the model that extended this idea of creative destruction, even there was a sequence in the patterns of innovation. First, it was essentially the product innovation gamble that seeded the industry itself in the first place, and eventually what created the shakeout is the advent of a successful process innovation gamble. It is interesting that we call this model as a continuous improvement model. Why do we call this as continuous improvement model? In this theory of continuous improvement, both product and process improvements or process innovation are actually happening simultaneously. One of the key differences of this theory relative to the other two that we've already discussed is this idea that demand curve is not fixed over time. As products become better or products acquire legitimacy, the demand curve also shifts outwards. And remember, the demand curve shifting outward has this effect of increasing not only the quantity consumed, but also the prices in the market. Since product R&D opens new markets, it does not lend itself to spreading costs over a lower volume, right? So the role of product R&D is essentially to come up with a new stream of products or services. And this means that there is less avenue for spreading that fixed cost over a larger volume in the current market. Since process R&D reduces the costs of existing products, right, it works in the existing market, it easily lends itself to spreading the fixed costs over a larger output, which implies that higher scale means that there are greater incentives to pursue process R&D by the incumbents, right? So this is an important thing that I would like you to keep at the back of your mind, right? So there is this scale advantage for process R&D, and you don't have the same kind of scale advantage when it comes to product R&D. And firms are choosing, right, given that this is a continuous improvement model, firms are essentially choosing how much to invest in process versus product R&D. Right? At every given point in time, they are thinking about, gee, how much do I invest in process versus product R&D? And the larger the firm's scale is, they are more likely to invest in process R&D given the scale benefits that we've already spoken about. To the extent that the first mover can capture scale much faster than, let's say, the movers or the entrants that enter a little bit later, it is natural for the first mover to move to process R&D a bit faster than the later entrants. So in that sense, the deck is stacked in favor of early entrants in this model as well. In this model, what creates the hockey stick growth, right? The sales takeoff that we spoke about. It is essentially this idea of legitimacy and acceptance, right? This essentially shifts the demand curve outward. Demand increases because of firm activities in new markets that are geared towards increasing the actual and the perceived product quality itself. So the hockey stick growth is not because of firm entry, but rather because of increases in demand. Firms hence enter expecting the demand to increase as well. So another key difference between these models is in the other set of models, given that the demand curve was essentially fixed, firms knew about that demand curve and they entered based on full information about their demand curves. Whereas in this model, given that the demand curve also is shifting, they have some noisy sense of demand and they enter expecting the demand to increase. What creates shakeouts or industry consolidation in this model? It is essentially the switch of initial entrants to more of process innovation. right? It is not about shifting to process innovation per se in totality, but it is about the share of process innovation becoming more dominant over a period of time, which as we discussed is very likely to happen when with the initial entrance in the industry. So when firms get larger, their focus or their emphasis becomes on process innovation. And what creates this idea of shakeouts? Given that firms are incurring these costs on process innovation, they are bringing down the cost of their products and services. And as costs gets pushed down, the firms that cannot match these kinds of process innovation end up exiting the industry as well. So how do these theories essentially apply to the online food delivery market? So this is where I'm going to bring in Mr. Rakesh Ranjan and ask him a few questions about the evolution of the online food delivery market.